Ayaan stood frozen in the dimly lit office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. His hands trembled as he held the letter, the verdict of years of relentless effort, sleepless nights, and sacrifices. We regret to inform you that your contract has been terminated, effective immediately. The words blurred before his eyes, but their weight crushed his soul. The walls of the publishing house seemed to close in on him. His dream of becoming a celebrated novelist, of seeing his name on bestseller lists, of inspiring millions, had just been ripped away. Ayaan, it's not personal, his editor Rakesh said from across the desk. The sympathy in his voice felt hollow. The market is tough. Your last 2 books underperformed. We have to. Don't. Ayaan cut him off, his voice hoarse. He didn't need sugar-coated excuses. He needed air. Grabbing his bag, he stormed out, ignoring the curious glances of the employees who once respected him. He was their rising star. Now he was nothing. The streets of Mumbai buzzed with life. Honking cars, shouting vendors, hurried footsteps of people chasing their ambitions. But for Ayaan, the world felt muted, as if he were walking through an empty void. He wandered aimlessly until his feet led him to Marine Drive. He collapsed onto the stone ledge, gazing at the restless waves crashing against the shore. Just days ago he had stood here, dreaming of success. Now his future was a black hole. A cruel laugh escaped his lips. He had given up everything for his passion, turned down a stable corporate job, distanced himself from friends who didn't understand his obsession with storytelling, and worked through illness just to meet deadlines. For what? Rejection. Failure. Humiliation. His phone buzzed. A message from his best friend, Kabir. Bro saw the announcement. Call me. We'll figure this out. Figure what out? He had nothing left. Ayaan shut his eyes, but instead of silence, memories flooded in. He was 13 again, sitting at his father's study table, scribbling his first story. His father, an English professor, had read it and smiled. You have a gift, Ayaan. But remember, talent is just the beginning. Hard work, patience, that's what makes a writer. Ayaan had carried those words like a shield. Through rejections, through self-doubt, through the moments when even he questioned his own talent. But now those words felt like a cruel joke. His father had died 5 years ago, before Ayaan's first book was published, before the world had a chance to break his son. Another memory. His mother's tears when he rejected a well-paying job offer to chase his dream. Beta, passion is beautiful, but the world is harsh. Will you be able to handle it? He had laughed then, full of youthful arrogance. Of course, Ma. You'll see. And she had believed in him. Just like Kabir had. Just like the readers who once eagerly waited for his books. Now he was nothing but a failure. The sky darkened as the city lights flickered to life. Ayaan remained still, staring at the endless horizon. What now? He could try again, write another book, pitch to another publisher. But the thought made him sick. What if he failed again? What if he poured his soul into another story, only to be told it wasn't good enough? What if this was it, the end of his journey as a writer? His fingers curled into fists. He hated himself, hated his dreams, hated the world for being so ruthless. A soft drizzle began to fall, cooling the heat on his skin but not the storm in his mind. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Kabir. I don't know if I can do this anymore. He stared at the words, debating whether to hit send. Then, as if mocking him, a notification popped up, an email from his publisher. Subject: contract termination details and settlement. A final nail in his coffin. With a bitter laugh, he turned off his phone and shoved it into his pocket. The waves crashed harder now, as if urging him to let go, to surrender. And for the first time in his life, Ayaan truly considered it. The waves still roared, but Ayaan no longer heard them. His mind was drowning in its own tempest, spiraling into an abyss where hope had no place. He sat on the ledge of Marine Drive, rainwater soaking his clothes, his phone still clutched in his trembling hand. The city behind him was alive, oblivious to his despair. Then a voice. You look like a man who's lost something important. Ayaan blinked, barely registering the presence of the old man sitting beside him. He was wrapped in a faded shawl, his face weathered but his eyes sharp, like he had seen too much of life and learned not to fear it. I don't want company, Ayaan muttered. And yet here we are, the old man replied with a soft chuckle. He pulled out a small, tattered book from his pocket and flipped it open. You know, there's a philosophy that says, what if this is happening for you, not to you? Ayaan frowned, his frustration flaring. What the hell does that even mean? The old man didn't flinch. He simply turned the book toward Ayaan. Read. Ayaan hesitated but took the book. The page was marked with a single passage. A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything that is thrown into it. Marcus Aurelius. Ayaan scoffed. More motivational nonsense. The old man smiled. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor who lost almost everyone he loved. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years. Thomas Edison failed thousands of times before he succeeded. And yet, they didn't see suffering as a punishment. They saw it as fuel. Ayaan clenched his jaw. Easy to say when you're not the one failing. The old man studied him. So, what are you planning to do? Sit here and let your failure define you. Ayaan's fingers tightened around the book. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I'm not meant for this. Maybe I was stupid to think I could ever make it. The old man leaned forward. Tell me something, when you wrote your first story, did you write it for money? For fame? Ayaan hesitated. No. Then why? Ayaan looked down at the book in his hands. Because I loved it. Because stories saved me when I was a kid. I wanted to do the same for others. The old man nodded. Then why are you letting a company's decision take that away from you? Ayaan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Because I feel powerless. The old man tapped the book. Then let me tell you the greatest lesson of all. There are only two things in life. What you can control and what you can't. Ayaan frowned. And what does that solve? The old man chuckled. Everything. He pointed to Ayaan's chest. Can you control how a publisher thinks? Ayaan shook his head. Can you control how readers react? Another shake. Then why waste energy on it? The old man's voice was firm. What can you control? Ayaan looked at him, realization dawning. My effort. My craft. The old man nodded. Exactly. Most suffering comes from trying to control what we cannot. But the moment you let go of that, you become free. Ayaan scoffed. Easier said than done. Of course, the old man agreed. But is drowning in self-pity any easier? Ayaan was silent. The old man took back his book and flipped through its pages. Seneca, another Stoic philosopher, was exiled and betrayed. Instead of letting it break him, he wrote his greatest works during that time. He didn't resist what happened. He used it. Ayaan looked away. And what if I fail again? The old man smiled. Then you'll write again. And again. Because the only way to truly fail is to stop trying. Ayaan stared at the ocean, his mind battling between resistance and understanding. Minutes passed in silence. Then, for the first time in hours, Ayaan took a deep breath, one that didn't feel like he was suffocating. He didn't have to win today. He didn't have to fix everything at once. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to give up either. Here. The old man pulled out a small notebook and handed it to him. Write something. Anything. Just remind yourself why you started. Ayaan hesitated, then took the notebook. He stared at the blank page, his fingers tightening around the pen. And then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he wrote. Ayaan had started to heal, just a little. The old man's words still echoed in his mind, guiding him like a flickering lantern in the darkness. He wasn't fully back, but at least he was writing again, even if it was just a few sentences in that small notebook. But life, cruel and unrelenting, wasn't ready to let him rise just yet. The first blow came 2 weeks later. Sitting in his cramped apartment, Ayaan scrolled through his email, still hesitant about sending his new manuscript to a smaller publisher. His fingers hovered over the send button when his phone buzzed. Kabir calling. Ayaan smiled, a rare thing these days. Kabir had been his anchor, always believing in him even when he doubted himself. Bro, you won't believe this. Kabir's voice crackled with excitement. I finally got a publishing deal. Ayaan's smile froze. Wait, what? My manuscript, the one I was working on for the past year. I sent it to that big publisher last month. They accepted it. I'm getting published, man. Ayaan swallowed hard. The same publishing house that had thrown him away had accepted Kabir. For a moment, silence stretched between them. That's amazing, man. I'm really happy for you. Ayaan forced the words out, but the knot in his chest tightened. Kabir hesitated. Look, I know this might be weird for you, considering. It's fine. Ayaan cut him off. Seriously, you deserve it. They talked a little longer, but Ayaan barely registered the words. When the call ended, he sat there, staring at his laptop screen. The send button remained untouched. His best friend had achieved the very thing that was ripped away from him. The rational part of his mind told him Kabir had worked for it, that he deserved it. But the wounded part of him, the part still bleeding from failure, felt like the universe had spat in his face. Why not me? The question haunted him, whispering in his ears like a cruel ghost. The second blow came when he least expected it. Ayaan had avoided social media since his downfall, but that night, unable to resist, he opened Instagram. Kabir's post was the first thing on his feed. Officially signed my first publishing deal. Huge thanks to Rayhan Siddiqui for making this happen. In's breath caught. Rayhan Siddiqui. His former editor. The very man who had rejected him, who had said his writing wasn't marketable, was the one who had signed Kabir. Rage ignited in Ayaan's chest. He wasn't angry at Kabir. Not really. But knowing that the same man who had tossed him aside had chosen someone else felt like betrayal. He wanted to believe Kabir had no idea. That this wasn't personal. But deep down, the darkness in him whispered maybe he knew. Maybe he never truly believed in you either. Ayaan clenched his fists. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't sad. He was furious. Ayaan stormed out of his apartment, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. His feet carried him aimlessly through the city streets. His mind a battlefield of rage and despair. Why does this keep happening to me? Why am I always the one left behind? The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows as he walked. His hands trembled, not from cold but from the storm raging inside him. Kabir had never seen writing as his life's purpose, not the way Ayaan did. To Kabir it was a side passion, something he experimented with. Yet he was the one who got the deal. He was the one moving forward. Ayaan's old wounds ripped open, bleeding insecurities he thought he had buried. What if I was never good enough? What if I was always just pretending? The thought dug its claws into him. All his life, he had told himself that writing was his destiny. That no matter the failures, the rejections, he would make it. But what if he was wrong? What if he was never meant to succeed? He reached Marine Drive, the same spot where he had once considered giving up entirely. The waves crashed against the rocks, relentless and unforgiving. A voice in his head whispered, maybe you should stop trying. Maybe it's time to let go. But another voice, quieter but stronger, pushed back. Are you really going to let this break you? He gritted his teeth, his nails digging into his palms. This wasn't just about Kabir. This wasn't even about the publisher. This was about him. He had a choice. He could let this destroy him. He could let bitterness consume him, let his anger turn into poison, let the world break him into a version of himself he wouldn't even recognize. Or he could rise. Not in spite of this moment but because of it. The words of the old man echoed in his mind. A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything thrown into it. Maybe this was his fire. Maybe this pain wasn't here to break him. Maybe it was here to forge him. Ayaan took a deep breath. His chest still tight but his mind suddenly clear. He wasn't done. Not yet. With a newfound resolve, he pulled out his notebook, the same one the old man had given him, and flipped to a fresh page. The ink flowed smoothly as he wrote his first words in weeks. I will not be buried. I will be reborn. Ayaan sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the notebook in his hands. The words he had written the night before echoed in his mind. I will not be buried. I will be reborn. Something inside him had shifted. The bitterness still lingered, but it no longer consumed him. The rage had not disappeared, but it had transformed. No longer a wildfire destroying everything in its path, but a controlled flame, ready to be forged into something stronger. For the first time in weeks, he didn't wake up with dread. He didn't check social media to see Kabir's success or reread his rejection emails. Instead, he opened his laptop and stared at the blank screen. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. The fear was still there. Fear of failure, fear of another rejection, fear that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't good enough. But he had a choice. He took a deep breath and started typing. At first, the words came slow, stilted. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering that he was wasting his time. But he ignored it and kept going. Sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph. By the time the sun began to rise, he had written more in one night than he had in the past 3 months. It wasn't perfect, but it was. And for now that was enough. Ayaan's transformation wasn't immediate. It wasn't some grand epiphany that erased his pain overnight. It was in the small moments. The moment he picked up his phone, saw Kabir's name flashing, and instead of ignoring the call, he answered. "Bro, I know things have been weird," Kabir said hesitantly. I don't want to lose our friendship over this." Ayaan exhaled, the old resentment flaring for just a second before he let it go. "You won't," he said. And for the first time he meant it. It was in the moment when he saw a rejection email from a new publisher, and instead of letting it ruin his day, he simply closed it and went back to writing. It was in the moment when his mother called, concern heavy in her voice. "Beta, are you okay?" And instead of lying, instead of saying he was fine, he admitted, "No, Ma. But I will be." These weren't victories anyone else would notice. But to Ayaan they meant everything. One evening, while scrolling through job listings, his eyes landed on something unexpected. Looking for a guest speaker. Overcoming failure in the creative industry. A writing workshop was looking for speakers to share their journey, both their successes and failures. Ayaan's first instinct was to scroll past. Who was he to talk about overcoming failure when he was still fighting his way through it? But then he thought about the old man's words. A blazing fire makes flame and brightness out of everything thrown into it. He had spent weeks learning to accept his failures, to stop running from them. Maybe it was time to share that with others. Before he could talk himself out of it, he typed an email. "I'd love to speak at your workshop. Here's my story." He hesitated for only a second before hitting send. The day of the workshop arrived faster than Ayaan had expected. As he stood backstage, his palms were sweaty, his heartbeat loud in his ears. What if he made a fool of himself? What if they laughed? What if, instead of resisting, embrace it? He took a deep breath. Then he stepped onto the stage. Dozens of faces looked up at him, waiting, expecting. He gripped the mic, exhaled, and began. "When I was a kid, I thought success was about never failing. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I wanted it badly enough, I'd win. But I was wrong. Success isn't about never failing. It's about failing and failing again, and standing back up every single time." He looked around the room. Pain is fuel. Every setback is a stepping stone. And if you let it, failure will build you into something unstoppable. The room was silent. Then applause. Ayaan stepped back, his heart pounding, not with fear but with something else. Pride. Later that night, Ayaan sat by his window, staring out at the city that had once felt like it was crushing him. Now it felt different. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of failure. Not of rejection. Not of the unknown. Because he finally understood. Pain wasn't his enemy. It was his greatest teacher. And he would never run from it again. Ayaan stood at the entrance of the auditorium. His heart steady, his breathing calm. The same city that once felt like a battlefield was now his proving ground. He had been invited to speak at a major literary festival, an opportunity he would have once killed for. A few months ago, he would have seen this as the defining moment of his redemption. But now he knew better. Redemption wasn't found in a single moment. It was built through every small battle he had fought, every rejection he had accepted, every doubt he had conquered, every time he had chosen to write even when his mind whispered, "What's the point?" This wasn't about proving anything anymore. This was about stepping into his fire. He took a deep breath and walked in. Ayaan had changed in ways he never thought possible. He no longer sought comfort. He sought challenge. He reached out to publishers again, not with desperation but with conviction. He sent his new manuscript with no fear of rejection, because rejection no longer defined him. He started hosting workshops, helping young writers who were afraid to take risks. He told them about his failures, his darkest moments, not as tragedies but as lessons. He even reached out to Kabir. They met at their usual spot, a quiet cafe where they had spent years dreaming about success. Kabir hesitated before speaking. "I know things between us have been. It's in the past," Ayaan said simply. And he meant it. He no longer carried the weight of comparison, of resentment. Kabir's success was his own, and Ayaan had his own path to carve. Kabir exhaled in relief. "I read your latest work," he said. "It's your best writing yet." Ayaan smiled. "It should be." It was written with fire. The literary festival was packed. The audience buzzed with excitement. Ayaan was the final speaker of the evening. Months ago, this would have been a nightmare, a test he wasn't ready for. Now it was just another step forward. As he walked onto the stage, a familiar face caught his eye. Rehan Siddiqui, his former editor. The man who had once told him his writing wasn't marketable. The old Ayaan would have seen him as an enemy, would have felt the sting of past rejection. But the man standing on this stage was not the old Ayaan. He took the mic and spoke, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with fire. "I once believed failure was the end. That when life broke you, there was no coming back." He let the words sink in, scanning the faces before him. "But I was wrong." He told them about the rejection, the betrayal, the nights he spent drowning in self-doubt. And then he told them what came after. "The fire didn't destroy me. It forged me." Silence. Then applause. Deafening, thunderous. As he stepped off the stage, Rehan Siddiqui approached him, an unreadable expression on his face. "Ayaan," he said, "that was incredible. I may have misjudged you before." Ayaan simply smiled. "You didn't misjudge me," he said. "I just hadn't found my fire yet." Then he walked away, free from the past. Later that night, Ayaan sat by the sea, the waves stretching endlessly before him. He no longer feared failure. He no longer feared rejection. Pain had not been his enemy. It had been his greatest gift. Every scar, every loss, every moment of despair had not buried him. They had rebuilt him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing success. He was simply walking forward, one step at a time into the fire. Ayaan sat in his sunlit study, his fingers resting on the spine of a worn-out notebook, the same one the old man had given him that night at Marine Drive. The pages were now filled with thoughts, lessons, and stories, evidence of a battle fought and won. He traced his fingers over the words on the first page. "I will not be buried. I will be reborn." He smiled. Looking back, he could see the pattern now. Every rejection, every failure, every heartbreak had led him here. If his first book had been a success, he wouldn't have learned resilience. If Kabir's success hadn't shaken him, he wouldn't have found his own fire. If he had never been broken, he would have never been rebuilt. Pieces fit now. Not because life had changed, but because he had. Ayaan's new book had just been released, but this time he wasn't obsessing over sales figures or reviews. He had found something far more fulfilling: mentorship. At a quiet bookstore event, he spoke to a group of young writers, their faces eager, their eyes filled with the same hunger he had once carried. One of them, a young woman named Riya, hesitated before raising her hand. "Sir, what if we never make it? What if we're just not good enough?" Ayaan smiled. He had once asked himself the same question countless times. He leaned forward. "Let me tell you a secret. Every writer who made it once believed they wouldn't." She bit her lip. "But what if we fail?" Ayaan chuckled. "You will. Over and over again." The room fell silent. "But that's the point," he continued. "Failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the foundation of it." Riya looked uncertain. "How do you know?" Ayaan picked up his notebook and turned to a random page. "I know because I failed more times than I can count. Almost quit. But the only way to truly fail is to stop." He closed the notebook. "Every rejection, every setback, it's not burying you. It's planting you. And if you keep going, one day you'll break through the surface." Riya's eyes glistened with something new. "Oh." And in that moment Ayaan knew. His journey had come full circle. That night, Ayaan stood by the sea once again. The waves roared as they always had. But this time he wasn't drowning in them. He was standing tall, unshaken. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He pulled out his notebook one last time and wrote his final words in it. "I was never buried. I was always meant to grow." He closed the book and walked forward into the endless possibilities ahead.